Karen thought towing his broken truck was her victory. But when the sheriff showed up and rolled it right back into his driveway, the whole neighborhood realized she had just humiliated herself. The morning sun rose over the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, painting warm gold across neatly trimmed lawns and freshly paved streets. Birds chirped on telephone wires, the air felt crisp, and the neighborhood looked like it had been designed straight out of a postcard. Yet beneath that calm, picture-perfect scene, tension simmered, an invisible current of judgment and control enforced by a group of neighbors who believed they owned more than just their homes. They were the self-appointed rulers of the block, and at their head stood a woman whose name alone made others sigh in frustration. Karen, the HOA president. For weeks, she had set her eyes on one particular target. At the end of the street sat a modest house with an aging but sturdy pickup truck parked out front. The truck wasn't flashy, nor was it a rusted heap as she often described it. It was lived in, worn from years of use, with dents that told stories of hard work and long roads traveled. To Karen, though, it was a blemish against her curated vision of what the neighborhood should look like. To the man who owned it, it was more than metal and rubber. It was his lifeline, a reminder of his years of labor and sacrifices, a symbol of his independence. That morning, neighbors gathered unknowingly to witness the moment humiliation would be staged. The sound of heavy chains clinking against steel jolted the quiet block. A tow truck rolled in, its amber lights flashing, and the driver hopped out with paperwork in hand. Karen marched beside him, pointing theatrically at the pickup truck as though she were unveiling some monstrous crime. Her voice rang out, loud enough for curtains to twitch and blinds to lift across the street. She wanted an audience. The homeowner stood on his porch, helpless, as the driver attached hooks to the undercarriage of the truck. He tried to protest, but Karen's smug smile cut him down. She waved a stack of HOA violation notices like they were weapons of the law. Neighbors peeked out from behind hedges and fences, some whispering sympathy, others quietly amused by the drama unfolding. The man's face burned with humiliation. It wasn't just about losing the truck, it was about being publicly shamed, treated as though he were a reckless trespasser on his own land. The pickup truck groaned as it was pulled onto the flatbed, tires squealing against the pavement. Karen crossed her arms with satisfaction, as if she had cleansed the neighborhood of its great stain. The homeowner's driveway now sat empty, a glaring reminder of his supposed defeat. Karen turned, meeting the eyes of nearby neighbors, silently daring them to oppose her. No one stepped forward. Fear of fines and retaliation kept them still. For the man on the porch, every second etched itself into memory. He felt stripped bare, mocked, made into a spectacle. This wasn't just a vehicle, it was part of his daily survival. Losing it meant more than inconvenience. It meant losing the ability to provide, to move freely, to stand tall as someone who had built his life through grit. The humiliation twisted into something deeper, a fire, slow but growing, promising that this would not be the end. As the tow truck rolled away, the sound echoed like a gavel slamming down in judgment. The cul-de-sac returned to silence, but the quiet wasn't peace. It was tension, thick enough to suffocate. Karen strutted back to her home, pleased with her victory. She believed she had asserted her dominance once again, proving that no one could defy her version of order. But unseen in her triumph was the storm already forming. For the man, humiliation had a way of sharpening resolve. He had been underestimated before in life, pushed aside, mocked, told he wasn't enough. Each time he had risen, not with loud words but with actions that cut deeper than anyone expected. This time would be no different. The empty driveway wasn't just a loss. It was a pause before revelation. The humiliation he endured that morning would soon transform into something no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. By sundown, whispers had already begun. Some neighbors muttered at how harsh Karen had been. Others feared what would come next. The man stayed silent, retreating inside. But his silence wasn't surrender. It was the silence of a storm gathering force, waiting for the right moment to break. When the first stars pierced the night sky, the cul-de-sac slept under an illusion of calm. But the stage had been set. The humiliated man was no longer just a target. He was becoming the underdog in a story that would soon flip the balance of power. Karen had made a spectacle of him, but she had also made her biggest mistake. Because tomorrow, the driveway wouldn't stay empty. Tomorrow, the sheriff would arrive. And when he did, the entire neighborhood would learn what Karen never bothered to ask: who this man really was, and how much power lay hidden behind his quiet endurance. The story had only just begun. Long before the tow truck's chains clinked against steel, before Karen's smug voice echoed across the cul-de-sac, the man at the center of this storm had already weathered battles greater than any HOA could ever imagine. His name was Daniel Carter, a man in his late 50s with weathered hands and a back that bore the stories of decades of labor. To the neighbors who passed him by with polite nods, he seemed like just another quiet homeowner, someone who kept to himself. But behind that quiet exterior lay a life of resilience, sacrifice, and a long journey through trials most people could not see. Daniel had grown up in a small Midwestern town, raised in a family that valued work above words. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a nurse who pulled double shifts to keep food on the table. From an early age, Daniel learned that dignity didn't come from appearances, but from persistence. That old pickup truck Karen despised so much wasn't just a vehicle. It was a family heirloom of sorts, one he had rebuilt with his father during long evenings in their garage. Every bolt, every scratch, every dent held memory. When his father passed, Daniel kept the truck as a living reminder that sweat and determination outlast almost anything else in life. Life had not been gentle with him. After high school, Daniel enlisted in the service, spending years stationed overseas. He carried the weight of discipline and sacrifice, but also the scars of silence. Returning home, he found a country that had moved faster than he had, neighborhoods that cared less about who you were and more about what you owned. The world seemed obsessed with appearances, and men like him, men who valued grit over gloss, were often dismissed. Still, he endured. He married, raised children, and worked tirelessly to provide. For years, he was a truck driver, crossing highways that stretched longer than some people's patience. He learned the rhythm of the road, the loneliness of night drives, and the quiet satisfaction of bringing goods where they were needed. That old truck was not just his father's. It had become his companion, carrying him through winters of ice and summers of scorching heat. When finances grew tight, it was the truck that helped him pick up side jobs, hauling equipment, moving furniture, and keeping the family afloat. But life twisted cruelly. A workplace injury cost him his trucking career. With bills mounting and retirement still a far-off dream, Daniel downsized, moving with his wife to a modest home in a suburban neighborhood. The promise of peace lured him there, the idea of a community where neighbors cared for one another. What he didn't expect was the suffocating presence of an HOA, a group more interested in rules and image than humanity. At first, Daniel stayed under the radar. He maintained his lawn, waved politely, and paid his dues. But his truck, parked proudly in the driveway, became a lightning rod. To Karen, it was an eyesore, an unwelcome relic that threatened the illusion of affluence she tried to project. She never asked about its history, never cared to know why it mattered. To her, it was a violation waiting to be punished. Behind Daniel's calm demeanor, deeper struggles brewed. His wife's health had begun to falter, leaving him juggling medical appointments and mounting expenses. His pride kept him from asking for help. To him, the truck wasn't just transportation, it was stability. His way of staying independent, of holding on to dignity when so much else felt like it was slipping away. Losing it meant more than inconvenience. It meant erasing part of his identity, stripping him of the last tangible thread tying him to his father, his past, and the grit that had carried him through storms. Yet Karen saw none of this. She saw only her version of perfection, a neighborhood polished like a showroom. She thrived on control, enforcing rules with the precision of a gavel. To her, Daniel was an easy target. A man without flashy defenses, without the wealth or social standing that others used to shield themselves. What she didn't know was that beneath his quiet endurance lay connections, respect, and a depth of strength that would soon rise. Daniel had friends in places Karen couldn't imagine. Old comrades from his service days, people in law enforcement who still remembered the sacrifices he had made. The sheriff's office wasn't just a distant authority to him. It was a circle that knew his integrity, men and women who respected his journey. But Daniel never boasted, never paraded his past. He let his character speak in silence, letting others underestimate him. The humiliation of that morning struck him not just as a personal insult, but as a reminder of the larger struggle he had always fought, the tendency of the powerful to trample the humble. It was the same struggle he had felt returning from deployment to a world that barely noticed, the same struggle of working endless hours only to be dismissed by those who measured worth in polished cars and manicured lawns. Inside his modest home, Daniel sat with the emptiness of his driveway visible through the blinds. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes carrying both worry and quiet strength. He didn't need to speak. She already knew. That truck was more than a machine. It was pride, memory, survival. To have it taken in front of neighbors felt like being stripped of his very story. But as shadows lengthened and the day turned to night, Daniel's resolve hardened. He had endured worse, and each humiliation in his life had become fuel for his next rise. Karen believed she had silenced him, that she had erased the truck as easily as checking off a box on her HOA violation log. But what she had really done was awaken the deeper fight within him, the fight of a man who had spent a lifetime proving that resilience outlasts arrogance. Tomorrow would not belong to her. The underdog she mocked was preparing to rise, and when he did, it would not be with shouts or petty retaliation. It would be with the quiet authority of truth, backed by the one force Karen could not control, the law itself. And as Daniel closed his eyes that night, he knew one thing for certain. The driveway would not remain empty for long. The morning after the truck was hauled away, the cul-de-sac buzzed with a strange energy. Neighbors watered their lawns and sipped coffee on porches, but their eyes drifted to Daniel's empty driveway. The absence of the old pickup was a silent headline, a public mark of defeat. For Karen, it was a triumph worth parading. She had orchestrated the spectacle and now relished the whispers it created. To her, this wasn't just about a vehicle. It was about power, a demonstration that no one in the neighborhood could defy her will without consequences. She wasted no time seizing the stage. At the next HOA board meeting, she held up photographs of Daniel's truck like evidence in a trial. Non-compliance, she called it, her voice sharp, dripping with authority. Around the table, board members nodded, some out of genuine agreement, others out of fear of being her next target. Karen spun the story not as one of control, but of community safety and aesthetic preservation. She insisted the truck was a hazard, an eyesore, something dragging down property values. By the time she finished, she had painted Daniel not as a neighbor, but as a threat to their carefully manicured world. Her narrative spread quickly. Flyers appeared in mailboxes reminding residents of vehicle compliance. Notices were tacked to community boards about unsightly objects that could affect neighborhood value. Though no names were mentioned, everyone knew the example was Daniel. He had been made into a cautionary tale, a living warning of what happens when someone dares to step outside Karen's narrow definition of order. Neighbors reacted in different ways. Some pitied him but kept their distance, afraid that siding with him would bring fines or harassment. Others quietly enjoyed the drama, whispering as they walked their dogs past his house. A few even adopted Karen's rhetoric, casting glances of disapproval at the modest home as though its owner had betrayed some sacred code. Isolation tightened around Daniel like a noose, not by accident, but by design. Karen thrived on dividing, on ensuring that no one dared question her authority without risking their own comfort. Inside his home, Daniel felt the sting of it all. His wife noticed the shift in the air, the way neighbors who once smiled now avoided eye contact. The humiliation from the tow wasn't fading. It was multiplying, feeding off gossip and public shame. For Karen, this was part of the plan, not only to take his truck, but to break his spirit, to make him either submit or leave. And yet Daniel's silence wasn't surrender. He spent the days quietly gathering information, pulling out paperwork, reviewing documents. He knew the HOA had stretched its authority. He knew their bylaws better than Karen assumed, and he knew the county rules that overshadowed her self-appointed power. Karen, in her arrogance, believed no one could challenge her knowledge of HOA law. But Daniel had spent long nights studying, fueled by humiliation that now sharpened into resolve. Still, Karen escalated. She issued more notices claiming Daniel's lawn was slightly overgrown, that his trash cans were improperly stored, that his mailbox paint was fading. Each one was a jab, designed not to correct, but to harass. The HOA fines stacked on paper like a weaponized tower, small charges accumulating into numbers that threatened to crush anyone without the will to resist. And Karen wasn't content with just paperwork. She made public comments at block gatherings, smiling sweetly as she spoke of upholding standards, while her eyes flicked toward Daniel's house like daggers. At one barbecue, she even joked within earshot that some people just don't belong in neighborhoods like ours. The laughter from her circle cut deeper than any fine. But what Karen didn't see, or chose not to, was that her arrogance had begun to sow seeds of doubt. A handful of neighbors who had known Daniel for years whispered quietly that she was going too far. They remembered his kindness, his willingness to lend tools, his quiet strength. They saw the humiliation for what it was, an abuse of power. But they too stayed silent, waiting for something to shift, for the underdog to rise. Daniel felt the weight, but he also felt the stirring of something else. Each fine, each insult, each public humiliation layered on top of a lifetime of resilience. He had been underestimated before, as a working man dismissed by executives, as a veteran returning to a society that overlooked sacrifice, as a father who held his family together through storms without thanks. This was not new. This was familiar ground, and he knew how to rise from it. Late at night, he picked up the phone and made a call. The voice on the other end was steady, respectful, carrying the tone of someone who knew him not as a target, but as a man of honor. Daniel explained what had happened, the truck, the harassment, the public humiliation. The voice replied with calm assurance, "Leave it to me." That phone call was the pivot Karen never anticipated. While she paraded her victory and basked in control, Daniel had quietly reached for the one ally whose authority dwarfed hers, the sheriff. Not just an enforcer of law, but someone who knew Daniel personally, someone who respected his history and his integrity. The humiliation had reached its peak. The conflict had escalated to a point where the stage was set for something dramatic. Karen believed she had stripped Daniel of dignity, that she had turned the neighborhood against him, that she had cemented her reign unchallenged. But what she had really done was push too far. The underdog was no longer waiting. He was preparing. And the next act would not be hers to script, because soon the driveway would no longer stand empty. And when the sheriff arrived, the power dynamic would shatter in ways no one in the cul-de-sac could have imagined. The third day dawned with the same picture-perfect calm that masked the storm brewing beneath the cul-de-sac. Karen stepped onto her porch with her usual morning ritual, coffee cup in hand, chin tilted high, scanning the neighborhood like a queen surveying her kingdom. The empty space in Daniel's driveway still brought her satisfaction. To her, it was proof that she could bend anyone into submission, that even stubborn men like him would eventually bow under her rule. She believed the battle was won, but the quiet wasn't going to last. Shortly after 10, the sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires drifted down the street. Curtains parted, blinds tilted, neighbors leaned from porches. A black and white sheriff's cruiser turned slowly into the cul-de-sac, its presence commanding attention without a siren. Behind it, almost in formation, rolled the familiar flatbed tow truck. But this time, it wasn't here to take something away. The cruiser pulled to a stop in front of Daniel's home, the sheriff himself stepping out with an air of calm authority. He was a tall man, silver streaks at his temples, his uniform pressed but worn with the dignity of years of service. This wasn't some rookie officer to be manipulated. This was someone who carried the weight of law and respect in equal measure. His gaze swept the street once, and the silence deepened. Karen, ever bold, rushed forward with the same smug energy she had displayed days earlier. She carried her binder of HOA violations like a holy text, prepared to lecture the sheriff on community standards. But before she could open her mouth, the sheriff raised a hand, commanding silence without a word. His attention wasn't on her. It was on Daniel, who stepped from his porch with quiet composure, his wife at his side. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Neighbors who had seen Daniel as the humiliated underdog now saw something different. The sheriff walked directly to him, shaking his hand firmly, speaking in tones too low for others to hear. Respect radiated from the gesture, the kind of respect that cannot be faked. And in that handshake, the entire narrative began to unravel. Karen blinked, thrown off balance. She had expected support, reinforcement, maybe even another display of Daniel's supposed non-compliance. Instead, she was watching the law itself acknowledge him with familiarity. The sheriff turned, motioned to the tow truck driver, and with precision, Daniel's old pickup was rolled carefully off the flatbed. Chains clinked as the tires kissed the pavement, settling perfectly back into its rightful place in the driveway. Gasps rippled through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors craned their necks, whispering furiously. To them, it looked like a reversal of judgment, a wrong made right in the most public way possible. Karen's smirk faltered. The sheriff's voice finally carried, steady and sharp. This vehicle is not in violation of county law, nor does the HOA have jurisdiction to remove it. Any further interference will be treated as harassment. The words cut like a blade through the silence. Neighbors stared, some wide-eyed with relief, others suppressing smiles they dared not show. The power that Karen had flaunted just days ago cracked beneath the sheriff's authority. Karen sputtered, clutching her binder tighter, flipping through pages as though she might find a clause to save her pride. But the community standards, she tried to argue. Yet the sheriff's gaze silenced her again. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His authority was final. And then came the twist that shattered every illusion. The sheriff placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder and addressed the crowd that had gathered. He spoke of Daniel's years of service, his dedication, his integrity. He revealed that Daniel wasn't just a neighbor. He was a decorated veteran, a man who had sacrificed for freedoms many of them took for granted. He wasn't some careless homeowner defying rules. He was a man who had given more to the country, and by extension to them, than Karen's power games could ever measure. Karen's face drained of color. The revelation struck harder than any fine or notice. She had not only harassed a veteran, but had staged his humiliation in front of the entire community. Now, in the same public square where she had strutted with pride, she stood exposed as arrogant, heartless, and ignorant of the very man she had targeted. The sheriff didn't stop there. He warned the HOA board that their authority had limits, that targeting individuals without due cause crossed into illegality. His words were not just protection for Daniel. They were a shield for every homeowner who had lived under Karen's shadow of fear. In that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. Neighbors who once stayed silent felt a spark of courage. If Daniel could stand restored, if the sheriff himself could draw a line, maybe they too could resist. As the truck sat proudly once again in Daniel's driveway, the symbolism was undeniable. What had been a scene of shame had become a monument of resilience. The same neighbors who had once watched in silence now murmured with awe. The underdog had not only risen, he had risen with the law on his side, exposing the hollow foundation of Karen's reign. Karen turned, her binder clutched like a shield, retreating toward her home. Her stride lacked the confidence it once carried. Each step was heavier, burdened not with victory, but with humiliation of her own. She had tried to script the story of dominance, but Daniel had rewritten it in real time, and this time, the whole neighborhood had seen. The sheriff lingered only a few minutes longer, exchanging quiet words with Daniel, a nod of assurance, then returned to his cruiser. As the vehicle pulled away, the cul-de-sac felt transformed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was charged, alive, humming with the realization that power didn't belong to Karen. It belonged to truth, to dignity, to the quiet strength of a man who refused to break. Daniel placed a hand on the hood of his truck, the same truck that had carried his father's fingerprints, his own sweat, his memories of the road. It was home again, and so was he. But the story was not finished. The sheriff's revelation had lit sparks that would soon catch fire. Karen's humiliation was only beginning, and the aftermath would shake the neighborhood more than anyone could anticipate. The sheriff's cruiser had barely turned the corner before the weight of what had just happened settled over the cul-de-sac. For a moment, no one moved. Neighbors stood frozen on porches and sidewalks, some with mouths still open, others whispering in disbelief. The sight of Daniel's pickup truck back in its rightful place felt almost surreal, like watching a story rewrite itself in real time. What had been humiliation only days earlier was now victory. Karen had retreated to her house, binder clutched to her chest. But even behind her closed door, the echoes of the sheriff's words reverberated. Her kingdom of control had cracked. The humiliation she had staged so publicly now rebounded on her with even greater force. The same neighbors who once nodded along to her rules now whispered about her arrogance. The same authority she wielded with smug certainty now looked brittle, fragile, exposed. For Daniel, the moment carried a different weight. He didn't gloat, didn't shout, didn't wave his arms in triumph. He simply stood by his truck, hand resting on the hood, eyes steady. His quiet dignity spoke louder than any celebration. Neighbors noticed. They saw a man who had endured humiliation without lashing out, who had waited for truth to do what shouting could not. That composure transformed the way they saw him. He was no longer just the man with the old truck. He was the neighbor wronged, the underdog vindicated, the veteran who carried himself with strength even when stripped bare. Slowly, neighbors began to move closer. A woman across the street, once quick to avoid him, offered a small nod of respect. A young couple whispered to each other before one finally said loud enough for him to hear, "Glad to see it back." An older man leaned against his cane, shaking his head in disbelief at Karen's recklessness. Their gestures were small, hesitant, but each one chipped away at the isolation Karen had forced around him. Where she had tried to divide, truth was quietly building connection. But Karen wasn't done. Not yet. Inside her home, she paced, binder open, flipping through bylaws and fine print as though somewhere in the pages she could reclaim her power. She made calls to board members, her voice rising, demanding unity, insisting the sheriff had overstepped. But the responses were muted, cautious. Some didn't pick up. Others gave short, non-committal replies. They had seen the sheriff's authority firsthand, and none wanted to stand on the wrong side of the law. Karen, who once commanded them with fear, now felt the sting of being abandoned in her hour of need. As the day unfolded, the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. Parents discussed it while walking children home from school. Retirees shared the story over coffee on back porches. The tale spread quickly, reshaping the narrative Karen had tried to control. No longer was Daniel the cautionary tale. It was Karen. She had humiliated a veteran, crossed legal boundaries, and stood publicly corrected by the sheriff himself. That night, the neighborhood was alive with conversation. Lights glowed in windows as families replayed the scene, some in shock, others in satisfaction. For Daniel, the night carried a quiet vindication. Sitting at his kitchen table, his wife across from him, he felt the tension that had knotted in his chest finally begin to loosen. The empty driveway had been a symbol of loss. Now it was a stage of redemption. His wife's eyes shone with pride, not just for the return of the truck, but for the strength he had shown in holding steady through it all. Karen, however, couldn't escape. Even in the privacy of her home, the weight of humiliation pressed on her shoulders. She imagined the whispers outside, the glances from neighbors who had once followed her lead. Every tick of the clock reminded her that control, once so absolute, was slipping through her fingers. She drafted emails, considered emergency HOA meetings, even thought of drafting new appearance ordinances. But no amount of paper could erase the sheriff's words or undo the sight of him shaking Daniel's hand in public. The board members who once rallied to her side now hesitated. Some began to question whether her leadership had gone too far, whether her obsession with power had crossed into recklessness. Others feared liability. The sheriff's warning about harassment wasn't just a rebuke, it was a legal line they had no desire to cross. Karen's throne was no longer secure. It was splintering beneath her. Meanwhile, Daniel's quiet strength began to ripple outward. Neighbors who had kept silent before felt emboldened. If the sheriff could stand beside him, perhaps they could too. Conversations shifted from whispers to plans. Whispers of challenging fines, of questioning board decisions, of finally standing up against the fear Karen had fostered. The tide was turning, not just for Daniel, but for the entire neighborhood. As midnight approached, the cul-de-sac lay quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. No longer heavy with Karen's control, it was filled with the hum of change, of an awakening community. Behind one window, Daniel sat in his chair, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows across his face. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was simply at peace, his hand resting on the old pickup's keys lying on the table. Justice had found its way back, and with it, respect. But deep down, Daniel knew the story wasn't over. Humiliation doesn't vanish overnight, and power doesn't surrender without a fight. Karen's pride was wounded, and wounded pride often lashes out. He had weathered storms before, and he was prepared for another. Because while the sheriff's reveal had flipped the balance, the real test was still ahead. And in that silence, as neighbors drifted to sleep with whispers still lingering in their minds, one truth glowed brighter than the street lamps outside. The neighborhood would never see Daniel the same way again. The days that followed the sheriff's intervention carried a different weight across the cul-de-sac. The air seemed lighter, the whispers bolder. Neighbors who once hid behind curtains now stepped onto their porches with new confidence. The old pickup, parked proudly in Daniel's driveway, had become more than a vehicle. It was a symbol. Its presence reminded everyone that truth had triumphed over arrogance, that dignity had silenced humiliation. But for Karen, the days were long and heavy. She tried to reclaim her image, calling emergency HOA meetings, sending out emails heavy with legal jargon, and posting new notices on bulletin boards about community standards. Yet each attempt fell flatter than the last. The board members she had once controlled with fear now avoided her calls, their loyalty fractured. Some even began quietly discussing the possibility of a vote to remove her from her position. Her binder of bylaws, once her weapon, now felt like a relic. The power it had given her evaporated the moment the sheriff placed Daniel's truck back in the driveway. Every time she walked outside, she felt the weight of neighbors' eyes, some pitying, some condemning, most indifferent. Her authority, once unquestioned, was now nothing more than a shadow of what it had been. Daniel, meanwhile, moved through those days with quiet grace. He didn't gloat, didn't seek revenge, didn't rub salt in the wound. He lived as he always had, steadily, humbly, keeping his lawn trimmed, waving at neighbors, offering a hand when needed. But his presence had changed. People noticed him now. Where before they had seen just another quiet homeowner with a dented old truck, they now saw the man who had stood against humiliation and endured until truth revealed itself. Respect followed him in small but meaningful ways. One neighbor, a single mother who had long endured Karen's constant harassment about the length of her grass, stopped by one afternoon with a plate of cookies, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you for standing up, even if you didn't mean to." It made the rest of us feel like maybe we can too. Daniel accepted the gesture with a smile, humbled but not surprised. He had always believed strength wasn't about loud victories. It was about steady endurance. As the HOA board convened later that week, the mood was tense. Karen came armed with papers, ready to assert her control again, but the energy in the room had shifted. Board members asked sharper questions, pressed her on her overreach, reminded her of the sheriff's warning. When she attempted to deflect, her voice cracked under the pressure. For the first time, she wasn't dictating. She was defending. And then came the motion. A quiet, almost whispered suggestion. Perhaps it was time for a change in leadership. The words landed like a hammer. Karen's face flushed, her hands tightening on the binder she once wielded with pride. But no one rushed to defend her. The same neighbors who had feared her fines now remembered the sight of Daniel's truck being restored, the sheriff's voice cutting through her arrogance. In that moment, her reign ended not with a dramatic outburst, but with the quiet, collective decision of people who had finally seen the truth. By the end of the week, Karen was no longer president of the HOA. She remained a neighbor, yes, but stripped of the power she had abused for so long. The binder gathered dust on her shelf, its pages powerless without the weight of authority behind them. She walked the neighborhood quieter now, her head lowered, her voice muted. For Daniel, justice didn't come in the form of her humiliation. It came in the restoration of dignity, not just for him, but for others. The single mother no longer feared fines for her grass. An elderly couple stopped worrying about their mailbox paint. The neighbors began to breathe easier, free from the constant shadow of her control. The truck in his driveway gleamed in the sunlight, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. It carried stories, history, grit, and now it carried victory. It stood as proof that arrogance could be challenged, that power could be humbled, and that resilience outlasted intimidation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and painted the street in golden light, Daniel sat on his porch. His wife joined him, her hand slipping into his. Together, they watched children ride bikes down the street, laughter ringing out. Neighbors waved, some stopping for brief conversations, others simply offering nods of respect. The cul-de-sac felt alive again, no longer suffocated by Karen's reign. The resolution was not loud. It wasn't marked by banners or celebrations. It was marked by peace, the kind of peace that comes when justice quietly sets things right. Daniel didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. The return of his truck, the respect of his neighbors, and the quiet removal of Karen's power were enough. Karen had believed she could control everything: appearance, power, perception. But she had forgotten that truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced. Her attempt to humiliate Daniel had only humiliated herself. Her attempt to strip him of dignity had only magnified his. And in the end, the neighborhood chose not her rules, but his resilience. That night, as the stars flickered overhead, Daniel looked at the truck parked in the driveway and felt the weight lift fully from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the underdog. He felt like a man who had been tested, humiliated, and underestimated, only to rise, not with anger, but with quiet strength that spoke louder than any gavel or fine. The tables had turned, and the neighborhood would never forget it. The cul-de-sac never looked the same again. Not because the houses had changed or the lawns grew any different, but because something deeper had shifted. The neighborhood had witnessed arrogance meet its match. They had watched humiliation turn into redemption, and they had seen the quiet strength of one man dismantle the power of fear that had hung over them for too long. For Daniel, the change was subtle but profound. He still woke early, tended to his yard, and kept his routines. But now, when he walked the block, neighbors waved more openly. Some stopped to talk, others offered thanks, and a few even admitted that they wished they had spoken up sooner. Respect replaced silence, and admiration replaced avoidance. Where once he was seen as the man with the dented truck, he was now seen as the man who endured injustice with grace until the truth could no longer be denied. The truck itself became something more than transportation. To outsiders, it was still just an aging pickup. But to the community, it was a reminder of what had happened. Children pointed to it when they rode by on bikes. Parents told the story quietly over dinner, and each time it caught the sunlight in Daniel's driveway, it seemed to glow with a quiet kind of victory. It stood as a monument to resilience, to the idea that dignity cannot be towed away, no matter how hard someone tries. Karen, stripped of her authority, faded into the background. She still lived there, still walked the same streets, but she no longer carried the same weight. Her once commanding presence was now met with polite distance, her words falling flat without the force of control behind them. The neighborhood had seen too much to fear her again. Her binder of rules sat forgotten, and though she occasionally tried to reassert herself in small ways, the effect was gone. She had become a cautionary tale, not of power but of arrogance undone. The true victory wasn't just Daniel's. It was the neighborhood's. His quiet endurance had shown them all that fear only works when people stay silent. The sheriff's revelation had lifted the veil. But it was Daniel's patience, his refusal to lash out or sink to Karen's level, that gave the moment its power. In his stillness, in his quiet dignity, he had taught them a lesson they would not forget. As weeks turned into months, the story spread beyond the cul-de-sac. Friends told friends, neighbors told relatives, and soon the tale of the towed truck and the humbled HOA president became one of those stories people retold because it carried a deeper truth. It wasn't just about a truck. It was about the underdog rising. It was about justice arriving when least expected. It was about the strength found in humility and the way truth, when revealed, can silence even the loudest arrogance. One evening, Daniel sat on his porch, the sun setting behind the trees, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold. His wife sat beside him, their hands intertwined. The old truck rested in the driveway, bathed in the fading light. He thought about the journey, about the humiliation, the fines, the whispers, and the sheriff's return. He thought about the weight of silence and the power of patience. And he realized something. The struggle had not been a curse. It had been a mirror, reflecting back to the community the truth they had been too afraid to see. Life has a way of testing us in the moments we least expect. Sometimes it strips us down, takes what we hold dear, and parades our struggles in front of others. But those same moments can also reveal the depth of our character. Daniel's story wasn't about revenge or power. It was about resilience, about holding steady until the tide turned. The moral was simple, yet timeless. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Power isn't always loud, and dignity isn't always visible. The ones who endure silently often carry the deepest strength, and when the moment comes, their truth can shake foundations stronger than any rulebook. The neighborhood learned that appearances don't define worth. They learned that authority without compassion collapses under its own weight. And they learned that respect isn't demanded through fear. It's earned through sacrifice, through patience, and through the quiet courage to stand, even when humiliated. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Daniel exhaled a breath that seemed to carry years of struggle with it. He had been underestimated, mocked, humiliated. But he had risen, not with fists, not with shouts, but with the kind of strength that cannot be taken away. The truck gleamed faintly in the twilight, a living reminder of what had been lost and restored. And in that moment, Daniel knew his story wasn't just his own. It belonged to every underdog, every person humiliated, every neighbor who had felt powerless under someone else's control. His story was proof that tables turn, that truth rises, and that even the quietest among us can become the loudest voice of justice when the time comes. And so the neighborhood slept easier under the stars that night, carrying with them a lesson that would echo long after. Humiliation may sting, arrogance may rise, but dignity endures. And when truth arrives, it cannot be silenced.